Hey everyone, we're going to be doing a quick lunch recitation on a couple bits that I wanted to touch on in earlier days, but I didn't have time to in regards with APIs. Um, Mainly how to use environment variables to change the API we're actually making our requests to, and then how to mock an API request using a promise. I'm also then going to go over authentication, and you won't need to have seen the other videos for that to really make sense. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So this part depends on how your backend person has set up their server. Some of them will have deployed to Heroku very early, and you'll have a URL pointing to that API, and you just use it, and that's totally fine. Others will have you do local development with a local version of the backend API. But we're kind of stuck here because the way we have this set up, I'm defining the API URL, and it's always pointing to either the local version or the Heroku version. So what we need to do is we need to have some way of telling React that I want to use the local version or I want to use the production version. And we're going to do that with environment variables. So if any of you have ever received terminal help from me in the past where we've had to debug some issues with yarn or npm, you've probably seen me make you do this. Echo $capital path. So part of our bash terminal that we haven't talked about too much is these environment variables. There's a bunch of variables like this capital path that have vital information for our terminal to work. There's other ones like browser that contains my default web browser, and that should actually be Firefox. I don't know why that's set incorrectly. And other things like there is editor. But we can also set these variables and then reference them within programs that are running in order to change their behavior. We can kind of think of it like a backdoor way of supplying arguments to yarn start. So the way we do this is I'm going to paste this in the channel and hopefully remember to put it in the description of the recording. We're going to do that with environment variables in a file called .env. So if you haven't read the React documentation, you should. It's very well written. But what we can do is we can create a file called .env. And we should never, ever, never, never, ever, never, never commit this to our repository. This doesn't go in the repository because most often you use this file to put in secret bits of information like API keys. You don't want that checked into your source repository. Now, nothing you actually put in here will be secret ultimately because it's all going to get packaged up into the web page that is then sent to your user, but it's still very bad practice to commit the .env file to your source repository. So what we're going to do is create a file called .env in the root of our project. So I go here where I see my package JSON, public, source. That's the root of the project. And then I'll create a new file called .env, and I create these environment variables. They have to start with React_app, and then I can name them whatever I want. In this case, I'm going to call this, what do I want to call this? I want to use this as kind of like a, I'll just call it environment. And I'm going to set this equal to, no spaces here, development. So then, if I restart my my yarn server, it's going to pick up that variable, and I can access it using a special command that is up here. We do process.env dot and then the name of our environment variable. So this way I can see that this is set to development and then use the development version of my API. Consequently, if it's set to production, or in my case not set at all, it will use the production version of the API. So what we're going to do is we are going to go back to the file where we defined our API stuff, and I'm going to change this to be a let. We're going to do this with if statements first. So I'm going to do if process.env.react app environment is equal to development. Then I want to set API URL to be the development version. Otherwise, else, I'm going to set it to be, this should be a Heroku link. So let's see if that worked. To my development server, reconnect. Okay. So let's, yeah, it looks like we have made our API requests correctly. Let me add a person. Yep, and that person was added. Let me change this environment variable to say production. I may need to reload the yarn start again for it to pick up those changes. There we go. And now we get a request 404. If I look in my network tab, we will see that I tried to make a request to, this should be a Heroku link, which is not a valid URL. But that's a quick way of getting conditional behavior depending on your environment, is using these environment variables. And there's an interface on Netlify that will allow you to set environment variables. We don't have to use the env file to do it. It's just a convenient way. There's also ways of setting it on the command line as well. So that is a quick way of getting different behavior out of our React app. And let me fix it real fast. Do we have any questions on this? No? Feel okay with looking at those environment variables? We can also, instead of using if statements here, we can do this with a ternary. We can do process.env.react app environment is equal to development. And then if this is true, we do localhost, and if not, we do the other thing. Same thing, but using ternaries. Alright, so then I want to show you really quickly how we would mock one of these requests. Because if you go back into, say, let's look at the edit functionality. I'm making this request where I am getting a team member from my my API, and then I'm doing some stuff with it. And I could replace this for now with not an API request, not an Axios request, and I could just call set initial person to some arbitrary data. But then I lose out on my ability to use .thens. So we can imitate the behavior of the Axios API by returning our own promise, because that's what this is. When we write this kind of asynchronous code, we're using promises. When we make our Axios request, our Axios.get, it returns a promise, and then we attach this .then to it. So whenever the promise completes, we then execute whatever callback is in our .then. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to assume that this get team member function, let's say this isn't implemented on my backend. So I'm going to create a fake API request. I'm going to create a new promise. Promise is a class. And promise takes a callback function. And this callback accepts two arguments, resolve and reject. The way a promise works is when we make a new promise, we're essentially saying, okay, I'm bundling up a bit of code that can run for as long as it wants to. But then, when it's done, it calls this resolve function with the data it would like to return. And I'm going to use that and pass it to my .thens. So watch this. If I just have this resolve and make an object, it's going to be our response object, so it's going to have res.data. So here's the data key, and then I'm going to make this data an object that represents our person. So they have a name of mock person, they have an email of mock email, and they have a role, that's it, a role of mock, and also give them an ID of 999. So what this is going to do is our promise is immediately going to finish, but we get to use our .thens off of it. So let me so then let's try and edit this person, and we see it works. We get mock person, mock email, and mock, because our promise provides the same interface as Axios, because all Axios does, it creates a promise, and when it finishes, it resolves to that response object. So we're just making a new promise that just resolves to our hard-coded data. And then when the backend person sets up the API, I can get rid of this, drop in my Axios request, and suddenly it works for real. So that's just a quick way to mock API requests. There are, of course, libraries out there that will do this to a much greater extent, but if you want to do that, then there's a quick tip. So any questions with this? No? No questions because it made sense, or no questions because it was confusing? Alright. Well, if no one has any questions, then I'm going to move on to auth, which is kind of the meat of this recitation. So before I start writing any code, I want to walk you through how authentication works. Here I have a, can I zoom in on this? Yeah. Okay. So here I have a piece of software called Insomnia. It's a REST client. It just gives me an easy way to make requests to a server without having to, write them in Axios requests inside of my React app. So here's the basic workflow that we have when we're doing authentication with client-side auth using JWTs, JSON Web Tokens. So the way it works is, let's just start from the beginning. Let's go through the whole flow. Here's the body of the request I'm sending, and then here's the response the server is giving me back. So our API is going to have some endpoint called register or sign up or something like that. And we need to give it some data, probably a username. Let's sign up good old Bard Belvin's, password. And in this case, I'm reusing an old project API, so they needed a department. You might have an email here or some other bit of information. This is just dependent on the API that we're using. So then we would send this request to the server, a post request, with the information needed to register this user. And then the server says, great, they've been registered. Now at this point, depending on the way your backend developer has done it, you might get a token back. For this implementation, we need this user to actually go and log in. And that's going to be very, very similar. To log in a user, we're going to send a post request to a different endpoint, probably login, something like that. So then we're going to give them the username of Bard and the password of, let's do something wrong. I get an error, 401 means unauthorized, so wasn't doing it. His password was test. Oop, did I do a lowercase Bard? Yeah, I did. So what we get back is a token. And it's just essentially a magic string that we don't really need to care about how it works. But I'm going to show you what it is, because I think that is valuable. This is actually a JavaScript object. That's why it's called a JSON Web Token. So if I paste this in here, it actually turns out that this is a big old JavaScript. It's actually a couple JavaScript objects. Encoded in what's called a base 64. So in the same way that when we write hex codes for colors, we're using base 16, we're using hexadecimal, so our numbers go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We represent 10 with A, 11 with B, 12 with C. We can also do a similar thing with base 64 instead of base 16, and that's what this format is. So it just decodes that, and then it's a stringified JSON object that contains the information about our user and literally the amount of time that they're allowed to be logged in until. There's also a signature, which is basically a little flag that is generated from the data with a secret on the server. So it's basically a little bit of encryption. It's a hash. And if I were to change the contents of this payload, if I were to change this object, the signature here would no longer match, because given the same input, we should be able to produce this same signature. So this is how we're able to do client-side authentication. We can literally give the user all the information that they need in order to be logged in, and then when they send it back to us on the server, we can check and make sure that that information is valid based on the signature we had also supplied them. So this just gives us a way to offload some of the cost of the server. They don't have to keep track of logged in users. The users get to keep track of whether they're logged in or not. But this necessitates now us having to send this token back to the server with our requests. So it knows that we're logged in, and it also knows who we are. Notice this has the username and the user's ID in here. So what we do is we send this token with other requests. So if I wanted to, in this backend server, get a list of users, that is actually protected. So if I make a GET request to this user's endpoint, I get a message, you shall not pass. because I'm not logged in. I'm getting 401 unauthorized. I'm not allowed to do this. But if I give them that token that says that I'm logged in, then I will be allowed to access that information. We do this by setting this token as a header parameter. Usually it's called authorization. Your backend person may have called it something different. And we set its value equal to that token string. So now when I send this request, the server is going to parse this token, see that I am barred, see that I am logged in, and it's going to give me the information that I want. So that's the basic way that we do authentication. We log in, they give us a token, and we just have to send that token back with each request so that I know that we're logged in. Alright, do we have any questions with this so far?
I apologize. I just came in.
Mm-hmm.
Someone on my team has a question. I think it has to pertain to something like this. I was just curious, are you answering specific questions or just going over something right now?
If I have time at the end, I can answer specific questions, but I'm more hoping to use this time right now to showcase how to do authentication.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think this is what they need to be here for too. Okay, that's
Okay.
all I want.
All right.
Thank you.
This will also be recorded, and a YouTube link will be posted in the channel later.
Okay.
All right. So now I want to implement this in.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh,
Just a general question, real quick.
please.
I worked with Postman the other day because that's what they told me to utilize.
Yeah.
Insomnia versus Postman. Is there a reason you have a preference for Insomnia?
I just like the interface a little bit better. I feel like Postman's got a lot going on. Postman is another more popular REST client, and they're virtually identical. I just like this one.
Yeah, it looks a lot cleaner. Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Alright, so now I want to take this and I want to do this in my React application. So I'm just going to reuse this current project, and I am going to add another endpoint called login. Going to make an index.js, not endpoint, I'm sorry, view. I'm going to import React from React, and then I'm going to define my login component. I'm going to take in some props. Going to export login. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to return a form. I'm going to have an input. Give it a name of username and a placeholder of username, and same thing for password. If we set this type equal to password on an input form, that's how we get those little black dots to show up instead of an actual password. So password, and then I'm going to add a button of type submit, and make it say login. So then I'm going to hook up my state, importing use state, and then I'm going to declare my state variables. I'm just going to call it set. You know what? I'm going to call it user, and set user. And use state is initially going to be user as an empty string, username as an empty string, and the password as an empty string. Then I'm going to use these as the values on my inputs. So it's going to be user.username, and password is going to be user.password. And let me format this just a little bit cleaner for you all. Okay. So now I've set up my managed form, but the values are always going to be the empty strings that I have in there, so I have to write my change handler, which is going to take in an event, and it's going to set my state, so it's going to call set state, it's going to call set user, and it's going to spread the user object, and it's going to replace the key with the event.target.name. So we're using this name as our key name, so it's going to be username on the username input and password on the password input, which matches these key names. And we're going to set its value to be event.target.value. So now that should be all hooked up. Let me go and check the app.js so we can get this routed up. So I'm going to import login from views login, and then I'm going to add this as a path. We'll make it /login, and that'll render my login component. So here we go, and let's check it out. If we go to login, there we go. We get our form, and I can type in it. And I forgot to actually add my handle change to these inputs. So I have to add the onChange prop to each of these and give them my handle change function. Okay. Now this should work. Yep, and I get those little dots there. So what I want this to do is when I submit the form, I want it to try to log in to my API. So let's do that. Let's import Axios from Axios. And I'm going to write a function called login. What do we want to call this? Handle login. And this is going to take in an event. First, it's going to call event.preventDefault because we're going to use this as the submit event handler. And by default, when we submit a form, it wants to refresh our page. We don't want that. So I'm going to prevent that default behavior. And then I'm going to make an Axios post request to my local API, http://localhost:/API/login, I believe was the correct route. Yes. And then I also want to send it the user object, which has the data in it. And inside of my .then, I'm going to get the response object, and I'm going to console log it so we can take a look. So I'm going to try logging in with the user we just created, Bard, with the password of test. And again, I forgot to add my handle login function actually on this. So for the onSubmit on the form, I want to use my handle login function that I just so painstakingly crafted. Okay, so we're going to log in with Bard and test. And let's see what happened in our console. We get a response back from our server, status 200, which means good. And if we look inside of data, we have our token, which we're going to need to send to the other endpoints in order to get the data from our server. But how do we want to keep track of this? We can put this inside of a state variable and pass it to props everywhere we need it. But that kind of seems like a lot of work to me. So what we can do is we can save this in local storage. That's a quick way of getting something in the browser storage so that one, it will persist through refreshing the page and leaving the page and coming back. But two, we can also access it in other places without directly passing it as a prop. So that's pretty convenient. Before I show how to do that, does anyone have any questions so far?
Yeah, real quick. kind of glossed over this in the lecture. Why is it that when you do the on submission and the handle login function, you do the event prevent default statement?
Yeah,
What
so
are you trying to prevent?
if I don't have this here and I
Mm-hmm.
submit this form, it refreshes my page and it also adds these URL parameters for my different input fields. And I don't want that to happen. This is how forms used to work. This is a way that we could send requests to a server with these URL parameters, but that's not what I want. And so that's the default behavior of the web browser. So if I put event.preventDefault in here, now when I submit my form, the page isn't going to refresh, and it's just going to do whatever I want. And we're not going to get those things showing up in the URL.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, any other questions with this?
Just expand on that. Is the reason you don't want it refreshed because it's like a single page app, or is that just?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
we don't want to refresh it and lose all of our state and also make them reload the whole page. Just kind of wasteful. I mean, sometimes if if you need to, you can refresh the page in order to like reset the state. But generally, we want to avoid refreshes as much as possible on single page applications because it's a lot of JavaScript the user is pulling down, and most of it will be cached, but still. Refreshes are a bad user experience on single page applications. Plus, if you noticed when I removed this, the event.preventDefault, and I put in stuff here. Oh, I need to save this file. So, does anyone know what my password is? You can't. It's a secret, right? Does anyone know what my password is now? It adds it, even if it's set type equals password to the end of our URL here as a URL parameter, and we absolutely do not want that. So, event.preventDefault, important on forms. We almost never want that default behavior. So, what we can do with this is we can save our token into local storage so that our user will stay signed in between refreshes. By signed in, all I mean is we have access to this token. If we want to log the user out, we can just delete the token. Technically, if they were to save it somewhere, they could put it back in local storage themselves and keep signing in. But this is build week. We're just trying to get it to work. We'll learn more about authentication when we learn it. What we're going to do is we're going to save it into local storage. So my token is at res.data.token. And I'm just making this variable so that I have a name we can work with. And then we want to save it into local storage. So local storage dot set item. We have to give it a name, a key that we're storing it in local storage. In this case, I'm going to call it token. And I'm going to store that token in there. It's a string, so I don't have to do json.stringify on it. I'm also not going to json.parse it when I get it back out. It's just a string. I can put it in, pull it back out just fine. You also might see this as window.localStorage. Both of these work. So now, when I log in with Bard, I removed my console log. If I go and check my local storage in my browser, local storage, not cookies. There we go. I see that my token is now saved in here. And I also have some other stuff left over from previous projects that I'm going to delete. So now I have my token in here. So I can reference this in other places. So if I wanted to, and I'm just going to do it on this same page, But if I wanted to anywhere else in my application make some request to display the protected route data on my server, I can do that. So I will do const, I want to call this something different. I'll just make this data. And I'm going to do a use effect. And inside of here, I will get the data of the users from the API, which is protected. We need to pass it the key, the token, as a header parameter. Let me import use effect. And then let me make my request. So this would be a GET request. And we would be going to http://localhost :4001. This would be at API and users, I believe. Where was this? Get users while auth. Yes. So that is it. And then let me make a .then. I'll get my response, and then I'll set my data to be res.data. So that will perform my request on the page load. It'll save it into my state variable, and then I'm just going to render it here. I'm going to do it the cheater way by just stringifying it and showing it on the page. So when our page refreshes, we get nothing. Uh-oh, what happened? We get a 401. We didn't pass that token with our request. And we have to for this route. This is protected. We need to be signed in order to access this data. So how do we add this token to our request? Well, your first thought should be, let me check the documentation for Axios, because that's going to tell us exactly how to do this. Axios add header param, which is the name of this thing. So it turns out that our Axios requests take multiple arguments. They take the URL as the first one, the data we're sending to the server is the second one, and then a config object is the third argument. And this config can contain things like the headers that our request is sending, which is how we want to send our token. So what I can do is pass that configuration object as the third argument. Here I don't have any data I want to send to the server, so I can just make this undefined. And then in here I can set the headers. I can make one called authorization, which is what the server expects. And then I can set its value equal to window.localstorage.getItem token. Whoop. Oh, local storage. Important to spell things correctly. So now I'm still getting a 401. Let's see if my request is correct. So that is to API/users. In my request headers, I am not seeing my authorization header. So where did I goop up? Here. Oh, that looks right. This is the actually the way that I wouldn't recommend doing this. I'm going to show you the more correct way of doing it next. So this is possibly why I'm not getting this to work. see, what if I remove this? There we go. Okay. So on post requests, we normally send some extra data to the server, like we do here. But on GET requests, in GET we're just requesting data, so it doesn't have 3 arguments. It just has 2. The URL and then the config object. So now we see I get my stuff back because I'm logged in. And if I were to go into local storage and delete that, I would no longer be able to log in. I've effectively logged myself out. So if I refresh the page, nothing's going to show up. If I log back in, my token is set, and now when I make the request, the server is going to give me all of my data. So, any questions here so far?
Oh, hey Henry, I came in kind of late, but I just have a general question since
Okay.
it might sound silly, but so is this token, or so this local storage, it only works will it work if you refresh the page or not?
Yes, it will work when I refresh the page because the token is saved inside of the local storage of my browser. So when I refresh the page, I lose all of my state, but my token isn't being stored in my state. It's being stored in my local storage. So when I refresh the page, it works because I'm grabbing the token right out of here.
Is there a way to circumvent the token expiration so that I don't have to continuously log in every 24 hours?
Nope. Nope. What you can do, though, is the backend person can provide an endpoint, often called refresh, where if you send it a valid token, it will send you back a token that is valid for the next 24 hours. So you can still have tokens with short expiration dates, but then you can have an endpoint where you can reauthorize the user without forcing them to actually go through the login process every time. Or the backend person can just make the tokens last longer. That's totally arbitrary. They can make them last for 100,000 years if they wanted to. But that's generally bad practice because right now we're just relying on the tokens expiring to actually log people out. So there are ways around that, but they kind of...
Henry, I had another question.
Oh, yes.
General.
Let me make sure. Did that answer your question? Jason, was that who asked that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Henry. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Every
All
time
right.
I press this Siri thingy, it messes up its own.
Okay. Well then, Vanessa, what is your question?
Maybe I can hear the answer in the recording later. Just ask it.
Okay.
So I was wondering this token thing. Would having a database, will it circumvent the whole token thing, or is that a whole nother story?
So can you hear me when I'm talking now? Guess not. So for the purposes of this recording and everyone else, part of the reason that we use these JSON web tokens is that the backend server no longer has to keep track of the users that are actually logged in. It generates these tokens, and then these tokens are valid for a certain amount of time. And if the user tries to modify the time that they're valid for, the signature of the token lets us know that they've done that, and we're able to reject it on the server. So now the server doesn't have to keep track of sessions, which is nice. Previously, the way that authentication worked before the popularity of JSON web tokens is that it was done via cookies. So the server would have a cookie store, is what we'd call it. And this can be backed by a database, an in-memory key value store, any number of things. But the database would the server would have essentially some place it could check and see if you were logged in based on some unique identifiable information they stored inside of a cookie that got sent when you made requests. JSON Web Tokens offloads that onto the user. Now, it doesn't completely, because what if we want to log someone out early? Like, what if they reset their passwords and we need to invalidate all the tokens that are logged in for their account? Then we have to start keeping track of additional stuff on the backend server. But as far as our client is concerned, it doesn't really matter. Either way, we're sending them some information that needs to be stored, either in a JSON Web Token that we put in local storage, or you can even use a JSON Web Token inside of a cookie, or just some tracking information used in a cookie. And this information is sent on every request, and it allows our server to know what's going on.
Okay, so it seems to me that you need a token regardless. Is that wrong?
You don't. So the token is a very specific thing. It has a structure to it that I showed earlier, where if I actually paste this, it turns out that this is a base 64 encoded string. And what the string contains is JavaScript objects. It's a JSON Web Token. It is straight up JavaScript objects. And so we see that this actually has a bunch of information in it. It has my username, it has the user's ID, and it has the time that this expires. What we would do with a cookie, you can also put arbitrary information inside of a cookie, although its size is limited, whereas a JSON Web Token size is not. With a cookie, you would maybe just like put a session ID or something in there, so that when it's sent to the server, they can check their database or their cookie store or wherever and see that, oh yes, that user is logged in for this session and it's valid until this amount of time. Okay, they can come on it. So either way, we need to associate some uniquely identifiable information with the request, and there are just different technologies to do that.
Okay, thanks, Aaron.
You're welcome. All right, so then this is cumbersome to include this headers on every single request we want to do. So the solution is right in our training kit. We can make a new function called Axios with auth or whatever we want, and what it does is it makes use of this Axios.create, which essentially allows us to apply config items to any Axios requests. So we basically create a special version of Axios that always has the authorization set to the token that we get out of our local storage. So I could most likely do this in another file, but I'm doing it here for the sake of simplicity. I'm going to define a function called Axios with auth. Oh, I have a spare equals sign in there. I just merged together. This is something I see people making mistakes with constantly, and I've finally done it, where I just merged together all of the function syntaxes. But we pick one or the other. We either use the function keyword or we use the arrow syntax, not both. I'm going to use the function keyword here. So what we're going to do is we're going to get our token out of local storage, which we can do anywhere. Get item, it is stored under token. And then we are going to return and create a new version of Axios that always has the headers set to our token. So in headers, we're going to create a key. It doesn't need to be a string. Authorization, and its value is going to be our token. And now what I can do is, instead of worrying about this here, I can just get rid of this whole config object. Oop, not quite what I wanted. And I can replace Axios with auth, and I just make my get request on top of it, just like normal. And if we go and check our React application, we will see that I spelled something wrong. Axios with auth. Why didn't I like that? Oh, the perils of live coding. Oh, goodness gracious. This is a function. This is a function that returns a thing. So of course Axios with auth.get isn't defined, because I'm just doing a function.get. I need to call this, which is going to return that Axios.create, which I can then use to make my requests. So now we see that that works. And we have this general purpose Axios with auth function that will grab our token out of local storage, apply it to our request, which we can make largely while ignoring the realities of the user being signed in. This is where we can also make use of our catch, which up until now I've been ignoring. This is where we can deal with a user not being signed in. So let's console log the error, and let's delete this token from our local storage so that our user isn't signed in, and we get the 401 back from the server. So what we can do is we can examine whether this error code is 401 or not, because there could be other errors. We could get a 500 error, the server might be broken, we might get a 404 error, we might have made a request to an endpoint that didn't exist. But if we get a 401 error, then it's telling us indeed that we are not signed in. So let's look at Axios errors. Let's see. Here's our handling errors section. So if we look at the documentation, which this should be our first stop when we have questions. Before you go to the help channel, look at the documentation. They probably have your answer here because you're not the first person who's wanted to do this. So how do we get the response code out of an error? Looks like it's error.response. So let's try that. Hey, now we get our whole response object. So I can get the status code out of here. So if the status code is 401, I'm going to change this to be an if statement. Probably would help. So if this is 401, then I can redirect the user to the login page. Or do whatever else I wanted to do. I could show them an error. I could send them to go sign up. I can do whatever I want. But this is how we start to leverage the rich interactions we get from our API. Not only does it send us data, but we can also use it to divine other information, like is our user logged in? How did our request fail? You know, we can use these status codes to work with our backend developer to make our application better. How did this request fail? What's the best way to handle it? Does the user need to log in? Was the username and password wrong? We can use these to do more valuable things for our user. So, any questions with this?
Not with this in particular, but one question before I forget. When you were putting your parameters into the Axios call, you used undefined. I was wondering if there's is better practice to use undefined versus null, since null is usually programmer defined, or?
I would leave it as undefined, because undefined is what arguments are set to when they're not given a value. If I'm skipping over an argument, whereas null is more of an explicit negative. Either would work in that case, although I was incorrect. If we wanted to do a post request, like if we did axios.post and we did our URL string, then we would do our data object, then we would do our config object, or data anything. If we wanted to skip this, it would work in either case if we made this undefined or null. If we were making a GET request like I did, you don't send data to a server with a GET request. You're getting data. So we wouldn't have that intermediary blanked out argument like we would on the POST request. But if you're making a POST request, you're almost always sending data here, so that generally wouldn't come up. But null or undefined, both fine. I would stick with undefined if I'm skipping arguments. That's just my intuition on this. That's actually would be a really good question for Dan about best practices in the JS community. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Fair enough. Thank you.
Great. So, this is how we do auth. We just have to post our login endpoint, save our token, and then we can define this Axios with auth function out in some other file, import it where we need it, and then use it basically like a normal Axios request, but it makes our user be logged in. And as we're rounding the base on Thursday, your backend devs should be getting their routes protected, so things that previously would work will now break if you're not logged in. So this is how we get around that.
Henry, are you intending to cover, I know we're not in Redux yet, but are you going to do any Redux as you go through this recitation or?
Yeah, I enjoy Redux, and when we get there, I will absolutely have some sessions about Redux, because I think that Redux is a very, very powerful pattern, whether or not you like the implementation in the library, and it's something that you see a lot in other user interface development environments, not just web frameworks, but it's a very old pattern in terms of how to deal with state management. And that's part of modern web development is reinventing the wheels in a lot of ways, of taking these patterns of desktop UI development and then grafting them onto what was supposed to be just a presentational document format. You know, HTML was supposed to just be like, hey, here's some text. You can style it a little bit. All right, that's it. And now we've invented this massive structure to recreate what we already had on the desktop. So yes, I will be doing stuff on Redux, and we're also going to see how to basically roll your own Redux using hooks and the context API, which is really cool. Yeah. All right. Any other questions on this?
Yeah. Could you briefly go over protected routes?
Yep. So a protected route is a route that a backend developer would have that will only work if you're logged in. So if they protected a route, then that means they expect to get that token identifying you as being logged in before they give you back whatever data or allow you to perform whatever action. So if we want to interact with that route, we have to let them know that we're logged in. If your backend dev is using JSON Web Tokens, which they most likely are, then you do it in this way. You send the authorization, or you send the token in an authorization header parameter. This is what this is called, and this is how we do it. And that way, when the backend developer gets the request, they will check the header parameters for a parameter named authorization. They will see the token, they will decode it, make sure you are who you say you are, and that you are allowed to be logged in, and then they'll give you back their data. So as a front-end dev, all we really need to worry about is setting the token into our local storage when we log the user in, and then getting it out whenever we make requests to any endpoints that require a user to be logged in.
Okay, so most of that would actually be covered in the backend.
Oh, like on how to actually set up a protected route?
Yeah.
Yes.
As far as setting that up.
Yes, that would be within the backend portion.
Okay.
We'll go over. I have a little server running. Right, where is it? Here. This is. All right, now. Where is it? Oh, I don't know where it is, but I have a server running in the background somewhere that is. Oh, this is it. So the user's route invokes a protected function. And if I look at the protected function, it literally gets out of this headers object the authorization token and then verifies it. And if it is correct, then it lets me through. And if it is incorrect, then it sends a 401 error. So you'll literally write this code one day. All right. Any other questions?
I just have a general question. It's pertaining to like Code Week. I know we're not talking about that explicitly, but it was just a question, if you don't mind.
Oh, please go ahead.
So, so in order, it seems like from looking at this or seeing this recitation that if a team like mine doesn't have someone like that has more knowledge on this, we wouldn't really be able to implement a working like a app, I guess, like that saves information from people. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, in the cases where you don't have a unit 2.75 dev, that's just a reality of the fact of how the cohort changes happened. So there isn't a full cohort ready for this build week. The people in 2.75 actually went back through the new curriculum voluntarily from their main cohort. So there are just way more of you than there are of them, so not every group, in fact most groups weren't able to get that dev. So what you're being asked to do is very much far beyond what we've been able to show you. And that's correct because you have an entire another unit to spend with React. It would be a shame if you already know how to do everything at this point. So I know with my students, I'm going to be very understanding of the situation they were put in at the start of the week. And if you look at the rubric for the build week, let me find it real fast. So this is for front-end developers. Here we go. So objective 1 is the project MVP. That's only one of all of this stuff. Honestly, in my opinion, it's not the most important one. You're gonna have projects that scope is beyond what you could necessarily pull off. You may have been greedy at the start of the week and thought you could do all this stuff, and it turns out you couldn't. You may not have a more senior dev who can actually show you how to use authentication. So this is most of what you're graded on. Did you work collaboratively? Did you write functional components? Did you organize your code well in terms of, you know, your UI elements where you're putting states, using useEffect? Did you use Axios requests to fetch data from the server and incorporate that into the content of your page? This is explicitly what is required of you. And then also, we want you to try to hit MVP on your projects, but if you can't, then I'm sure your team lead is going to take that into consideration as well. So, while it may not be an emotionally fun experience to really be stretched this week and have the expectations seemingly set much farther than what you can reasonably achieve, it's good. This is good. build weeks are a place where everything can go wrong with very little consequence. I know, like I've been telling students since week one, like it turns out the hard part of coding isn't writing the code, it's communicating with other people. Um, like I'm sure most of you think, like if this week was just like trying to make a React app, that would be much preferable than trying to make a React app with other people involved. Because it's hard. It's hard to work with others. It's hard to collaborate. It's hard to plan, where it depends on all these people doing all these things at the right time. And so this is a learning experience. So even if you're being pushed way beyond your comfort zone, even if the goalposts are set beyond where you can achieve, that's fine. You're going to learn exactly as far as you can go. You don't have to stress out. As long as you're doing all of this stuff, you're going to be fine. And you get to learn a lot. And then next time the build week rolls around, you'll get to be that senior dev. And you'll get to help your junior dev in the exact ways you wish you had that help. And that's going to be a very gratifying experience.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Henry, for clarifying all that. My team, we were in a meeting, and anyways, we just can't get everyone in the team in the same Zoom. And we just feel constantly like there's something missing, but I don't know what it is. And like, we don't have the knowledge to know what it is. So,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I feel so much better.
You're welcome. All right. Do we have any final questions? I don't want to eat into your project time too much. All right. Well, then, I think that's it. Thank you all so much for coming, and I'll see you later.